Maidin Waihig of the League and Chin, all your listeners as well.
And a
Good
very
morning.
happy Christmas, and you're looking resplendent in your, it seems, festive iron jumper. I'm not sure if it's only because it's the time of the year, but I'm getting the Christmas vibes off you.
Good. Well, sure. Listen, when we have a father of five, one couldn't but have Christmas vibes with Santa coming. Yeah, it is the festive season, and we're looking forward to it now. And we'll all, please God, have a good and safe Christmas
Yeah.
despite all the challenges of the present time.
Indeed. Last year, when we were talking about the history of Christmas, we talked about winter solstice, the pagan festivals celebrated around this time of year, and the Roman Empire and ancient times. Let's talk this year about the Christian story of Christmas. And it's like everything we talk about, really. It's trying to separate fact from fiction, myth from reality, and all that kind of stuff. So, what's your reading of it?
Well, look, Christmas, as everybody has a different maybe understanding of Christmas, and everybody loves Christmas. And people have over the years, artists, poets, musicians, they've added bits of stories into it. Some of it's myth, some of it's simply untrue, some of it's ignorance, and it's been embellished and added to over the years. So how do you separate the fact from the fiction? And then to understand what actually the Christian narratives in Scripture, what does it actually tell us?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about the birth of Jesus. And I just wonder, at the moment it feels to me that that's not as much what Christmas is about. Yes, it is for some, but it seems we've moved to this commercial thing. I think if you asked, 25, 20, 10-year-olds, they might think Santa was born at Christmas and not Jesus. But before we get into the history of that, do you think that goes in cycles, or has it gone in cycles over Christmas, that there's a move away really from, the maybe the more religious, traditional element of Christmas, or are we turning away on a journey that we can't go back on, if that makes sense?
I think so. I think there's a journey, what you say, people are moving away. The world is becoming more secular. We're being feeling like as humans, we're God and we can make decisions, and science and reason is beyond everything. But, there are still people that have their Christian faith. And if one thinks of the Christmas story itself, there was only a handful of people involved in the event, the divine event of Christmas. These were all poor people, Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, very, very small handful of people. And maybe we're going back to that as well. But that's not to say that people, I still think, have the spirit of Christmas and understand the spirit of Christmas. They may not understand that the Christ is in the Christmas. It's more secular and look at everybody to their own, so to speak. And maybe for people maybe trying to understand what it is that we do know about Christmas theologically and scripturally and historically in geography is maybe the direction we are going to go in today.
Let's talk about that then. So in terms of the recording of the birth of Jesus in the Gospels, is it across the board? How many Gospels record this? And tell us a bit about that.
That's a very interesting question, Greg. And people, again, maybe don't know these things, but there are 4 Gospels, as we know. Only 2 of them talk about the birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. And stuff that is written in Matthew's Gospel is not to be found in Luke's about the birth, and stuff that's vice versa. So there's a lot of anomalies. And maybe the beginning point is the genealogy. Matthew, for example, is writing a Gospel. He's a Jew, and he wants to be seen as presenting Jesus as the fulfillment, as the Messiah, as the person that will suffer, die, and bring redemption. So everything he writes from a Jewish point of view. And he gives a genealogy of Jesus, going back to Abraham and David, because he wants to show the royal lineage that is very, very important for the Jews. And he gives 6 14s. Now, numbers are very, very important for the Jews. 7 is the perfect number. So then the next number 7 after the 6 14s is the fulfillment, which he would like to present as Jesus. As for Luke, doesn't give the genealogy of Jesus at his birth. He gives it later on when he's baptized as a grown man. And he gives 76 names. And of the 76 names, Luke and Matthew give, most of them, there's only 3 in common. So there's a lot of anomalies there that don't add up. And again, for Luke, it's the 77th person in the genealogy from Abraham is Jesus. So 7 by 1177, again, the perfect number for the Jews. So the genealogy is very, very interesting. And Matthew, at the very end of his genealogy, says Jacob, that's father of Joseph, who was betrothed to Mary. So he doesn't say that Joseph was the father of Jesus, but that he was betrothed to Mary. And that was important because it put the whole biblical prophecies in the Old Testament that the child would be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. So Jesus, both through the mother's bloodline and through Joseph's bloodline, was of David's genealogy. The Jews, all Jews know which tribe they belong to. There's 12 tribes of Israel: Reuben, Levi, David, so on and so forth. So it was just to make important that Jesus was of the royal blood of David, and it was prophesied that the Messiah that they were expecting would come from the city of David, which is Bethlehem.
So what was the relationship then between Mary and Joseph, as much as we can determine?
Well, again, there's a lot of unsures here. Some would believe that Joseph actually was married before. Was he a widow at this stage? Did he have other children? It's believed that he had, and that Jesus had half brothers. That's, some theologians will say that, some disagree. Mary, again, what age was Mary? What age was Joseph? We believe that Mary was about 15 when the Annunciation happened, when the angel appeared to her, a very, very young girl. Joseph would often come across as being a much older man, but what we do believe is they were related, possibly first cousin or second cousin, and that Joseph was betrothed to her. And that was, for the Jews, equivalent, really. It was a serious judicial agreement. It was almost equivalent to marriage, whereby when you were betrothed, you lived with your parents for one more year, and after that year, then you went to live with your husband. That was the Jewish custom of the time. And Our Lady being 15, it sounds very young today, but in the culture that people lived in at that time, people didn't live beyond 40. So childbearing happened at a very young age, particularly for young girls. They got married and betrothed at a very young age, and clearly this was the custom of the time, and that's what happened to Mary. Yeah.
And in terms of the story that we know, right? I mean, how much of that is based on any of the writings in the Gospels? The donkey and the manger, and the stuff that is represented. Say, we know all about that, but how much of that has changed over the years, and I suppose more recently, or is that, have we been following that story for a long time?
Well, again, people often think of the crib as some kind of stable, but one needs to just step back a little bit. When they would have gone to Bethlehem, the city of Bethlehem in Judea, what happened was there was a census decreed, and the way the Jews worked as families, they didn't do it in their own villages. They went to their ancestors' home. And Joseph, being of the royal blood of David, David's city was Bethlehem, so he had to move to Bethlehem, to travel to Bethlehem, which he did, a journey of somewhere between 70 and 100 miles. And so when he arrived there, all the people belonging to the tribe of David. So could you imagine the morning, all the O'Donnells arriving into Donegal town, or all the Murphys arriving into Galway or wherever? The place would be mobbed. So here's a woman, pregnant, almost ready to give birth, poor, herself and Joseph, and there's no space for them. And it's not that they were maybe rejected, but the fact was she was about to give birth. Would she wanted to have gone into a crowded house to give birth? So it would appear that she was offered a stable. And in Bethlehem, even to this day, the hills around it are honeycombed with caves, small caves that were used for the animals. And it is believed that in a place like that, where Mary gave birth, where she would have had quiet and peace.
Okay, we're going through the history of Christmas with historian Joe Kelly. Joe, talk to me then about the role of the wise men and also the shepherds. They're also very much associated with the story and the crib and what have you. What do we know about that?
Well, what we do know is that there was a census called by Caesar. Some would argue that it actually wasn't the reason that Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem, but they did travel to Bethlehem, and they were in Bethlehem. Both Gospels let us know that's where he was born. And then the question is, how did they travel there? They would have traveled by donkey, and they could have gone the direct route, which would have been over hills, the Jezreel Valley, which would have taken them about 70 miles and would have been, as the crow flies, would have been hard. Or they could have gone down by the Jordan Valley along the river, which would have been flat and would have been maybe 100 miles. So it would have been easier for Mary. And so therefore, we believe that they arrived into Bethlehem, the longer route, and it probably took them upwards of a week traveling. And so when they arrived there, as we said already, the place would have been mobbed with people that were there to register themselves. And then they're taken to a stable. So now they're out, so to speak, on the hillside. And obviously shepherds are there. Shepherds are seen as the lowest class of society because they don't own land and they're tending to sheep. So shepherds have a terribly important part to play in the whole story, and we'll explain that in a minute. But she gives birth to her child, and then again, angels turn up a terrible lot in the Christmas narratives, more so than anywhere else in Scripture. Very, very important. And one of the words they use all the time, be not afraid, none to Mary, or don't be troubled. Every time they appear, to be it to Our Lady, to Zachariah, or to the shepherds. So they appear to the shepherds, and the shepherds were confused. Now, these were poor, uneducated people. They were told that there was a child born, it was the Messiah, and they would find a child in a manger in Bethlehem, wrapped in swaddling clothes. And so they set off. There was a sense of urgency. Anytime the angels appear, the people that meet the angel or encounter the angel, there's a sense of urgency after what they did. Let us go quickly to see if this is true. And they rushed off to the stable and found Joseph, Mary, and the child there. So the shepherds were very, very important. And what's lovely about the whole thing is, and this is maybe goes back to your question about, are we moving away from the Christian Christmas? And maybe we are, but the point is that God didn't reveal himself to the intellectuals or the scientists or the smart or the royal people. He revealed himself. The divine event of the child being born was done in among very poor people and a very small number of people. It was a very quiet thing. And to think that supposedly the king was born in a stable, like the carpet was straw, his cot was a trough out of which animals ate. It's the grandeur of the simplicity of that. It's a kind of ironic to say that, but it was such grandeur given to him in a very, very simple way. And so the shepherds understood this, and they went away, obviously, and spread the word then. So we have that, and then later on we find the three wise men supposedly arrived, but there is no evidence that there were actually three wise men at all. That came at a later time. We do know that they were astronomers, that they did study the stars, that they were of a priestly class, and they'd come from Persia, from the east, and they went to see Herod to tell him ask him, where's this king that's to be born? And Herod was obviously very, very aware of his own royalty and didn't want any threat. And he said, look, if you find the child, come back and tell me so I can pay him homage. But obviously he wanted him killed. He didn't want to have anybody usurping his power. So the wise men head off, and they eventually find the child. They're following some star. Again, it's very symbolic because these aren't Christian or Judean.
And sorry, why would they? Because you've talked of the geography of it. And this might sound like a really simplistic question. Why follow a star? Why not just head to Bethlehem?
Well, they didn't.
Because obviously Mary and Joseph were able to navigate there.
Yeah. Well, they didn't know where the child was to be born. They're obviously kind of a magician. They were magicians or astronomers, or they kind of understood that there was something divine to happen. They were trying to read the stars. They didn't probably have all the information.
And did they come bearing gifts? And what's the significance of them?
Oh, God, you're very good. Well, first of all, to make it correct, we don't know how many wise men there were. There is nowhere in the Bible it says three wise men. That came later. Venerable Bede said that there were actually three of them and gave them a name, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar. And you asked a very good question. What did they bring? Well, the first man, Melchior, he was a long-bearded older man, and he brought a gift of gold. And that's the idea of royalty, that Jesus was of royalty. And then Caspar, he was a bearded man, but a very young man, and he brought incense. And again, that's the idea of his nobility, of divinity. That's the symbol of incense. And then finally, Balthazar, who's believed to be a coloured man, an unbearded coloured man, he brought the gift of frankincense, symbolic of death, symbolic of suffering and that what would happen, Jesus. So that was the three gifts, but we don't know if it was three men. We don't know if it was three gifts. Obviously they did. But could you imagine three men of that caliber with their camels and their caravans? They've been traveling for months, and they obviously had people with them. They just didn't arrive on their own. And arriving into a stable, they probably couldn't communicate to this 16-year-old girl. They didn't have the language, who was just after giving birth. You could imagine what was going on. It must have been an amazingly interesting interaction. They couldn't communicate, but that they were here to reverence a child. And well, you can imagine what Mary was thinking at 16. What's going on here?
Yeah, you've mentioned the census a couple of times, and it's a bit of a by-the-by question. What was its function? Like, why were there so many O'Donnells and Murphys in Bethlehem at that time?
Well, very good.
I'm kind of conflating your metaphors, but you know what I mean.
I understand. Well, they're better than the Hugheses, maybe, or the Kellys. The interesting thing about it is that, we do census now every 5 years, and it's got very technical. But when Caesar was in command of Rome, he was known as the bookkeeper of Rome, and his empire was massive. It ran from England into and Germany down into Northern Africa and round into Syria and modern day Israel. And he created a census fairly regularly for Rome, where he ruled in the Tiber River, but he decided to have one done for his whole empire. He wanted to know how big his empire was, what population, obviously to get taxes later on down the road, to know what everybody owned. And he sent out 20 commissioners, 20 people to go and do this census for him into the various outposts of the Roman Empire. And it took 25 years to do this. So supposedly this was done when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now there's debate whether that really happened or not, because King Herod was the king of Judea at that time. So why would somebody from Syria further up, another country, be carrying out a census when he was the king there in that area? So there's some contradictions. And again, everybody thinks Jesus was born in the year 0. You have BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini. Jesus was probably, according to the theologians, and Pope Benedict has a great bit of research done on this, somewhere between 6 and 7 BC, Jesus was born. So the figures are wrong. See, when Christmas wasn't celebrated initially, the Christian Christmas, until 325, because the Christians were persecuted in Rome, so they weren't allowed to practice their faith. And then after 325, they began to celebrate Christmas when Constantine allowed the Christians to practice.
I know we touched on this last year, but December 25th, that is a nominal date, is it? I mean, in 325, do we know when Christmas was being celebrated? It's not actually on the day of the birth of Christ, is it? Or perhaps it is. My recollection is you says it wasn't.
Yeah, you're very correct in that. Look, the winter solstice, the Sol Invictus, the Solus is the Irish word for light. Sol is sun in Latin. So the invincible sun, Vincent, to conquer the invincible sun, was a pagan festival around the 20th of December, ties in with winter solstice, as you said at the beginning of the program. And so when Christians then were allowed to celebrate Christmas, they had to go, this monk Dionysius had to figure out when it was, and he went with the 25th of December. The reality is that it could have been any day in the year, but it just that it tied in with that. Some believe it was March, April, even as late as June. We don't actually know the date of Jesus' birth. And so it was just that it was timely for the Christians to say Natalus Sol Invictus is the birth of the invincible son, i.e. that Jesus was the invincible S-U-N, the invincible son. So it was Christianized. And then over time, then it was then the Christ Mass, the celebration of the Christ Mass. So look, you're asking a very, very good question. And again, when was he actually born? I'm unsure, and I don't think anybody can answer that question.
We were talking about. I think this used to be done at Mass, the blessing of the cars, did it, or did we used to do it outside? But a caller says we should bring back the tradition of blessing of cars travelling a week before Christmas. Just a pity these things die out. We need it. I think that I have a recollection when I was younger of cars being blessed at a Sunday Mass. Maybe, I don't know. Does that ring a bell with you, no?
No, it actually doesn't.
Right, maybe someone out there can help. 0866
We're still using the
Huh?
We're still using the carts and horses. We are not as advanced as...
Well, the donkey has a cross on its back, which has healing properties. It represents the donkey carrying Mary to Bethlehem, says a caller. And lastly, but not least, morning, Greg. Can you wish Dr. Joe Kelly and his family a very happy Christmas from the Macquaries in Carragard?
Oh, thank you.
Right.
Thank you very, very
Listen,
much.
have a great one. It's always the case that it feels like we're only scratching the surface, but we will reconvene again into the future and unravel some more stuff.
Well, listen, happy Christmas to yourself, to Caroline and the team there in Highland Radio. Agus the luck and maybe one of the messages we were talking about today, the angels, non to Mary, not afraid, despite what challenges we have, and no doubt Christmas will be difficult for people in many different ways. People that have a sense of loss and maybe an empty place at the table this Christmas. That we're all in this together, and we all have a Christmas spirit. And please God, that we all have a peaceful and happy and safe Christmas.
Agreed. Take care of yourself. Thank you very much indeed, Dr.